probably clicked onto this video because either you or someone you know is experiencing or has experienced some form of mental illness to one degree or another, whether it's been openly spoken about or not. But the fact is that over 46% of the population will experience mental illness at one point or another over the course of their lifetimes. And that percentage is also skewed significantly as mental illness is increasing rapidly in younger generations. So much so that globally, suicide is the second leading cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds. Mental Health Ireland states that those who are younger on average scored lower on the well-being scale than those who are older. On average, those who are unemployed and those who are full-time homemakers have a lower score than those who are in full-time or part-time employment. And on average, women have a lower well-being score than men. In other words, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the most oppressed groups in society suffer the worst with poor mental health. Specifically those who are most negatively affected by class society, both in terms of its class-based exploitation at the base levels of relations of production, and its superstructural modes of oppression like patriarchy and white supremacy. And class society's negative effect on mental health has been a well-documented phenomenon for decades. A distinct inverse relationship does exist between social class and mental illness. The linkage between class status and the distribution of patients in the population follows a characteristic pattern. Class 5, the lower proletariat, lumpenproletariat, almost invariably contributes many more patients than its proportion in the population warrants. Among the higher classes, the bourgeoisie and the upper sections of the petty bourgeoisie, there's a more proportionate relationship between the number of psychiatric patients and the number of individuals in the population. The working class, and especially its lower sections, disproportionately experience mental illness, and beyond that are the least likely to receive the appropriate level of support for these issues. In other words, mental illness is not just something that negatively affects everyone equally, regardless of social standing, but is in fact a class issue, our class issue, inherently baked into capitalist relations of production. So, let's talk about this. Let's take a look at the root cause of most of our societal maladies and what we can do to collectively solve these problems. But first, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below for new Marxist educational videos every second Friday, alternating between introductory Socialism 101 videos and then applying that theory in video essays like this. If you want to support Marxist educational content and believe creators like me deserve the minimum wage of subsistence, then toss €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, which you'll find linked in the description box below. If you're not in a position to support financially but you want to help out, then please share these videos around on social media like Twitter, Reddit, Discord, Instagram, etc. Now, as mentioned earlier, it's been scientifically demonstrated extensively that the lower one sits on the socioeconomic ladder, the worse off they're likely to be with regard to mental health and with receiving appropriate treatment for ill mental health. This of course will come as no surprise to the growing number of precarious workers in the gig economy who live a life of uncertainty with regard to whether or not they'll even be able to pay next month's rent. Not only is their work precarious, but under this current economic order, their very existence is precarious. And what this really points to is the systemic class-based nature of this issue. You're not alone in your anxiety, your depression, the trauma you experience, and any number of other mental health problems that have been created or exacerbated by this system. Every single one of us, of the class of working people, struggles with this to some degree. However, as a result of bourgeois ideological propaganda, particularly intensely since the advent of the so-called neoliberal era, we've been collectively brainwashed into seeing our shared struggles as isolated, atomized, individualized problems. We've been hoodwinked into believing that these side effects of the capitalist mode of production, its negative effect on mental health disproportionately affecting the exploited and oppressed masses, are our own individual personal shortcomings, as though we each live in a vacuum devoid of any social context. We're made to believe that the problem doesn't lie within the system itself, but that the problem is instead within each one of us. In Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher wrote that, for the ruling class, it's been necessary to reframe the growing problem of stress and distress in capitalist societies. Instead of treating it as incumbent on individuals to resolve their own psychological distress, instead, that is, of accepting the vast privatization of stress that has taken place over the last 30 years, we need to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill? The mental health plague in capitalist societies would suggest that, instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional and that the cost of it appearing to work is very high. Yes, I did just reference capitalist realism, and no, I don't agree with all of Fisher's positions. But he does make a good point here. Why should we accept the individualization, or privatization as he says, of mental illness? Why should we be okay with the fact that so many people are now mentally ill in the first place? As mentioned at the start of the video, nearly half of the population will experience a clinically diagnosable form of mental illness at some point in their lives. And this disproportionately affects the working class, especially its members who bear the brunt of patriarchal and white supremacist oppression. We take this for granted as just normal, but it's not. We only perceive it as normal because the ruling class has normalised our suffering as part of their bourgeois ideology. The individualization of the collective experience of mental illness is a superstructural method of maintaining the capitalist mode of production. This is the capitalists ideologically dividing and conquering us because, God forbid, we may recognise that this is a shared struggle and we may consequently actually take collective action to solve the problem together, which would necessarily mean the abolition of capitalist relations of production, and that's the real fear. As Susan Rosenthal put it in Mental Illness or Social Sickness, we know what's wrong. A few people accumulate wealth and power at the expense of everyone else. What's the treatment? Capitalism must be replaced with a socialist society that puts human needs first. Who can deliver this medicine? The global working class majority. What's holding us back? Lack of clarity and organisation. I don't expect this diagnosis will ever appear in the DSM. So it's been made clear thus far already that mental illness disproportionately affects the most oppressed and exploited groups in society, that this aspect is a feature of class society in general. But there's still a temptation some may feel to simply try and create a friendlier capitalism, to fundamentally preserve the current economic order but provide better mental health services with a stronger social democratic welfare system. But in fact, where the capitalist mode of production remains, and it does remain under social democracy, there'll always be this problem. Do you know that feeling you get at work of being a cog in a machine? A strong welfare system won't get rid of that. That feeling is a result of the fact that the capitalist system is, by necessity, built on isolation and estrangement, or, in other words, alienation, and many different types of alienation at that. As a quick reminder from the recent Socialism 101 video on this topic, workers are alienated from the product of our labour. We produce goods, which the capitalist then takes away from us to sell and realise a profit, creating an immediate disconnection between us as workers and the products of our labour. As our labour power is purchased by wage or salary at a lower cost than the value that our labour itself produces, we can never afford to purchase back all the products that we've created from the capitalists. The products of labour are thus permanently detached or alienated from us, the workers who produced them. Workers are also alienated from the act of production itself insofar as the fact that we don't freely engage in production of our own accord, producing what we ourselves need or desire, but we instead labour in order to gain a wage so that we may survive. If we don't work, we can't afford food, shelter, clothing, or any of life's necessities. We consequently sell labour power to capitalists not freely of our own accord, but are forced to do so as a result of economic coercion. Consequently, we perform the labour demanded of us by capitalists who seek nothing more than the realisation of profit to the detriment of all else, determined by the whims of the market and the chaos of production. So not only are workers alienated from the act of production under capitalism due to the economic coercion which forces us to sell our labour power, we're also alienated by what the capitalist forces us to produce, whether that's the shoes that are made in the sweatshop or the burger that's prepared in the restaurant. Neither are produced in accordance with the needs or desires of the workers ourselves, but instead in accordance with the requirements of capital. As workers don't control the means of production, we find ourselves controlled by the means of production, transformed into little more than an appendage of a larger process of production over which we have no control, merely cogs in someone else's money-making machine. And the final point is that the capitalist system fundamentally alienates us from each other. This is demonstrated most concretely in Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, which reveals the way in which the commodities that we encounter on the market mystify us and obscure the real human relations which are involved in the creation and distribution of these products. For example, it's generally impossible for us to know the workers in the sweatshops and the working conditions under which the products we encounter on the market have been created. The worker who produced the product is detached from it, and we as consumers purchase these detached products. This means we as consumers are also detached or alienated from the workers themselves who produced the products. Thus, the real social relations between people ourselves are hidden, and in its place appears to us merely relations between things, the money in our pocket and the product on the shelf. So we can see in these ways that the capitalist mode of production itself fundamentally makes us detached, disconnected, estranged, and alienated from one another. And this isn't just a feature of the neoliberal period of capitalism as some would suggest, but capitalism in any of its manifestations. You feel detached, isolated and alone because the capitalist system depends on this. Capitalist relations of production fundamentally necessitate alienation, and no amount of social democratic welfare programs will ever be able to prevent that. The only thing that can stop this is the working class oppressed masses rising up collectively and transforming the relations of production by transitioning to stateless, classless, moneyless society, once and for all ending the exploitation of man by man. But of course, the capitalists do everything they can to hide this necessarily revolutionary solution in order to maintain their exploitative system which grants them wealth and power at our expense. So they individualise and atomise our collective struggle, offering solutions that can only, at very best on the off chance that they even remotely succeed, simply make the intolerable feel tolerable, to make our shared oppression and exploitation feel bearable. Mindfulness is now chief among these patchwork solutions, at least here in Ireland where the government's spending hundreds of thousands of euros trying to promote it. But as pointed out in a recent article by the Connolly Youth Movement, at its foundation, mindfulness encourages you to adjust yourself to the world as it is, rather than changing the world. Mindfulness sets itself up as a viable alternative to collective organising and struggling for improved wages and conditions. Where in the past you'd correctly identify your well-off employers and their exploitative practices as the root cause of many of your stressors, now you blame yourself for failing to cope with them. How convenient for capitalists that workers disassociate from the systemic nature of their problems and only blame themselves. Nail, meathead. And we see this same pacifying, atomising approach manifesting in all bourgeois solutions to mental illness to one degree or another. And it's often in a way that's completely perverted by the profit motive, such as in the pharmaceutical industry, the self-help industry, and so on. But where there's a collective problem, there must be a collective solution. And if the system itself, the economic base of society, the capitalist mode of production, is making so many of us ill, or at least exacerbating illness, then the only solution is revolution, superseding the current order and beginning the socialist transition to stateless, classless, moneyless society, wherein the capitalist relations of production that are currently making us sick no longer exist. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't reach out to get the help you need to meet your daily demands, and indeed many people will find various forms of solutions offered up by society currently do alleviate some of the harshest symptoms and make their lives bearable, especially if we're talking about the most severe forms of mental illnesses whose causes are biological and neurochemical rather than social. But speaking to the more widespread lower level mental illnesses that most of us experience to one degree or another, if we seek permanent solutions to these collective problems that stem from the alienation inherent to capitalist relations of production, then the best thing we can do is to join revolutionary organisations and take part in the real movement to abolish the present state of things. These issues are taken seriously in all revolutionary organisations that are worth their salt. In being part of a collective movement, you'll not only be given support in day-to-day life by a close group of comrades, but also be working towards abolishing the very conditions which have given rise to or exacerbated your illness. Again, speaking for many, though not all, cases of mental illness. Comrades involved in the revolutionary movement in the Philippines have spoken openly about their experiences, showing how revolutionary theory and organising can, in itself, have a positive effect on those suffering with mental illness. One countryside peasant organiser named Sisam spoke of her experience of suffering for many years with bipolar, self-harm and even attempts on her own life. She then went on to join the revolutionary movement and stated that, "Before I was organised, I didn't have Marxist methods to clarify things for me. I didn't have a guide on how to analyse my problems, what is primary and secondary, internal and external, and that's why I felt I was just this passive mass of contradiction who knows nothing but feels sorry for herself and be angry at the world." Collective life, criticism and self-criticism, CSC, are important in managing this disability, Sam said. Through regular sharing of personal dispositions, like the widely practiced 3 checkups, comrades can help those with mental disabilities to objectify situations and resist subjectivism. This is in contrast to life in the cities where individualism is widespread, where nobody cares and where only the rich have access to medical treatment and therapy. It is important to stand against the stigma against people with MHP or mental health problems and unscientific ideas regarding this. So to wrap up, the relations of production inherent to the capitalist mode of production are inherently alienating. This causes or exacerbates much of the mental illness that we see permeating our society today, particularly regarding depression, anxiety, stress, and so on. Capitalists take this fact and attempt to profiteer off it by offering all kinds of individualised patchwork solutions that merely treat symptoms while never addressing the root cause of the problem. In fact, the ruling class doesn't want to address the root cause of this problem because this situation is very profitable for them. All they require is a functional working class to maintain the current economic order, and so the limit to the support that they'll provide us is the absolute bare minimum level for our subsistence. But our class doesn't want to just survive, we want to thrive, and revolution is the only solution. To finish off with one final quote from the practical experience of the revolutionary student Front Austin: capitalist social relations necessarily entail social alienation, and these relations are at the root of most mental health issues. Thus, unless the question of how to bring about the destruction of these capitalist social relations is at the forefront of any attempt to combat mental health issues, our practice is doomed to be qualitatively no different from the bourgeois mental health service system or that of the slimy non-profit organisations. We instead believe that the more helpful path for any person's mental health is to become involved in class struggle. So let's get active, get organised, join revolutionary organisations, and tear down this barbaric system once and for all. Right, thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. Thanks especially to the supporters on Patreon who've made this possible. Thank you Ian McShay, Ukopnik, Borku Gorilla, Ryan Hodgson, Soup, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Napalis, Brian Rose, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Southern Comrade, Mekalova, Rock Artist, Grengry, Todd Sprang, Nike the Sage, Zakasi, Anglo-Irish Bolshevik, Amy Schmidt, Eli Leslie, Thomas Ross of Mud, Jason Schmidt, Delcy Bolt, Train H13, Meowsifer, Mitch Schiller, Donald Quishleva, Sixney Valen, Kale Marks, Roja, MLM in Practice, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Coil Rapp, Vuchko, Doc Toma, Oyob Farah, Becky, Pastor Schubert, A Mouthwash Bottle, Mr. Miyamoto, Coil King, Reverend Lon Nom Hollywood, Wonderbad, JT Chapman, Jose, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Comrade Amara, Wealth for the 99%, Spoop, and Trailer Park Communists. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill.